Wizards of the Coast is rapidly becoming one of the most reviled companies in modern gaming. First, they revoke their open gaming license and return it only after causing an internet outrage. Then, they send Pinkertons to intimidate a customer. Add to this the numerous strange creative decisions like handicapped accessible dungeons or race swapping Lord of the Rings characters. Players and DMs alike are seeking alternatives to D&D. In this video, I'd like to teach you how to play Dungeon World, which is my go-to fantasy RPG. Dungeon World is not a perfect game, but it is much better than D&D, and it's not associated with Wizards of the Coast or Hasbro. It is powered by the Apocalypse game. This means it shares the same rules as many other PBTA games. If you know how to play Dungeon World, you more or less know how to play Monster of the Week, Urban Shadows, Action Movie World, Monster Hearts, Kids on Bikes, Kids on Broomsticks, Masks, Apocalypse World, and many others. It opens new possibilities for your gaming table. Best of all, it's easy, and it does not require a heavy financial investment, unlike D&D. One of the key differences between D&D and Dungeon World is the combat and how challenges are resolved. So in Dungeon World, it's a narrative-driven combat system, which can be more engaging and more immersive for the players, but it's also not realistic. I would argue that neither is D&D, but D&D is tedious and unrealistic, whereas Dungeon World can be fun and unrealistic. The first thing to understand is that in Dungeon World, only player characters roll dice. The Game Master never does. If you see a move in the rulebook in which dice are rolled, you know it is a move for player characters. In D&D, every player character and every creature has a turn to attack or move or cast a spell or some other action within a 6-second turn. In Dungeon World, only the player characters execute moves in which they roll the dice, and the Game Master has moves on behalf of the rest of the world, NPCs, the environment, spells, etc. And the results of the GM moves are automatic. There is no rolling. I know that's different and may be hard to understand at first, but once you get the hang of it, combat is action-packed and quick. Let's take a look at the hack and slash move, which is the basic attack move if you're doing melee combat. So what you would do if you're a player character and you wanted to attack, let's say, an orc or something, is you would take two six-sided dice. It's always two six-sided dice. You roll the two dice. You add whatever modifier it indicates within the particular move you've chosen here. In this case, it's strength. If there's a 3-letter abbreviation, then it's the modifier for that ability. If it's the full name, if it actually spelled out strength, that would be the full value of your strength. So, for example, a strength of 18 has a modifier of +3. But in this case, so you'd roll 2 dice, add your strength modifier, and then you would consult this table. So it says when you attack an enemy in melee, roll plus STR. On a 10+, you deal your damage to the enemy and avoid their attack. At your option, you may choose to do plus 1d6 damage, but expose yourself to the enemy's attack. On a 7 to 9, you deal your damage to the enemy, and the enemy makes an attack on you. And you might notice that there's nothing for 6 or less, and that's because 6 or less is a failure. And that's when the GM moves come into play. That's when the GM gets to do whatever he wants. Maybe the orc hits you, maybe your weapon breaks, maybe the ceiling collapses. Anything could happen. It's up to the GM. Now here's the volley move. This is what you would use if you were using a ranged weapon. And let's just read it. When you take aim and shoot at an enemy at range, roll plus dex. On a 10+, you have a clear shot, deal your damage. On a 7 to 9, choose one. Whichever you choose, you deal your damage. You have to move to get the shot, placing you in danger as described by the GM. You have to take what you can, get minus 1d6. You have to take several shots, reducing your ammo by 1. And again, there's not a 6 or less because a 6 or less is a failure, which really means the GM decides what happens as resolution. Now you might notice there's a pattern here. 10 or greater is a success without consequences. 7 to 9 is a success, but it's a qualified success. And then a 6 or less is a failure, and there are consequences for that failure. All right, so far so good, right? That's pretty easy. Now, what if you had a more complicated situation? Some kind of trap, let's say. Well, that's where Defy Danger comes into play. So here's the Defy Danger move taken directly from the rule book. It again follows that same pattern. 10 or greater is a unmitigated success. 7 to 9 is a success that's qualified, and then 6 or less is a failure. But what's interesting about the Defy Danger move is that the modifier is based on how the player approaches the problem. So, for example, if they try to just power through, they use strength. If they use quick thinking, they use intelligence. If the player can think of a way of using his best stat, he can get the best modifier. Okay, fine, but what about magic? There are classes just like in D&D, and the wizard class has a cast a spell move. With that move, again, there's the same pattern of 10 or greater being the highest success, 7 to 9 being a success with consequences, and 6 or less being a fail that causes some kind of consequence. On this particular move, let's just read it. When you release a spell you've prepared, roll plus int. On a 10 plus, the spell is successfully cast and you do not forget the spell. You may cast it again later. On a 7 to 9, the spell is cast, but choose one. You draw unwelcome attention or put yourself in a spot. The GM will tell you how. The spell disturbs the fabric of reality as it is cast. Take -1 ongoing to cast a spell until the next time you prepare spells. After it is cast, the spell is forgotten. You cannot cast the spell again until you prepare spells. So what kinds of things can the GM do? Well, the correct answer is anything he wants, but this list is from one of the websites for Dungeon World. So deal damage is a very understandable, very easy one to grasp. So if you should attack an orc and you get a failure, maybe you miss and the orc hits you. You know, things like use up their resources. So the GM could have your rations fall down a pit or something like that, or be destroyed by a fireball. And there's other moves that are interesting to think about, like offer an opportunity with or without cost. Adventures are also done differently. So most, if not all, Apocalypse World games use something called fronts. And the idea is that there is some kind of impending doom coming, and the players need to address it. This is a little bit different than in D&D, where the adventure would just be probably a patron in a tavern who says, I'll give you some gold to go do this thing. You can still have that, of course, but whether or not the players take the gold from the patron, there's still something coming. The example I always give is Godzilla. A front is built off of grim portents and impending doom. So grim portents are hints of something coming. And then impending doom is the consequence that if the grim portents aren't dealt with, you're not going to like it. So my Godzilla example. So grim portents for Godzilla might be there's something in the water outside a town, beneath the surface, something big. Next grim portent, distant roaring is heard. Then the next grim portent, heavy footsteps, Godzilla is on the beach. Then the next grim portent, Godzilla is just outside of the town. And then the impending doom would be Godzilla destroys the town containing the PC's headquarters. So those grim portents would be played as moves throughout the game. So you'd probably, at least in my games, this is the way I do it, I introduce that first grim portent early on, before anything happens. So I'll say, something is in the water outside of town beneath the surface, something big. Now, the player characters can go address that right away. They could just go out there and see what's happening and fight or stop Godzilla in whatever way they decide to stop Godzilla. If they don't address it, if they just kind of keep going about their business and doing other things, then when I have a chance to make a move, then I go to the next one. The distant roaring is heard. And then if they still don't address it, then the heavy footsteps, Godzilla's on the beach. And he's getting closer and closer and closer each time. But this could be any kind of countdown clock, any sort of an impending doom that's coming. Maybe the wizard has some sort of spell that's going to, be bad for the players in some way. Or the orcs are closing in, or whatever it might be. But it's an interesting, different way of handling adventures. There are other moves, of course, but they're basically all fall into that same, 10 or greater, 7 to 9, 6 or less pattern. So you pretty much, just from this video, just from what you've heard this far, you know how to play Dungeon World right now. Just take, some store-bought adventure or some just adventure seed that you have in your mind, turn it into fronts. You probably want around 2 to 4 fronts is pretty good. I wouldn't go more than that unless you have a real long game. You can get Dungeon World off of Amazon or drivethrurpg.com. I think it's a great game. I think it's a lot of fun. Again, it's not the perfect game, but I'll tell you, my group, we every now and then say, "Oh, we should play D&D." We get the nostalgia bug, and we say, "Oh, we should bust out the old D&D books and play some D&D." And we start reading it, and we start, making characters and all that, and we just go, let's just play Dungeon World. Definitely don't give Wizards of the Coast or Hasbro any more of your money. Okay, that's it.